Hey, welcome back to the channel, everybody. Alright, let's start off with thanking Dick Pritchett Real Estate for having these wonderful cams we get to watch. And I also want to thank all the wonderful volunteers who've been working on this for the past several months. Thank you all very much. Alright, so let's get into it. We're going to start with Sunday, 5/14. At 6:30 a.m. 22 is not in the nest tree, but he comes to the nest tree shortly after that, about 6:36. At 7:30 a.m. M15 returns to the nest tree with an intruder, and he has a fish. M15 goes to the nest. The intruder lands above in the branches above cam 1. 22 flies to the nest and gets the fish, and M15 exits the nest quickly. The intruder makes an attempt to either steal that fish or attack 22. I'm not sure which one it was, but 22 does this kind of lean back move that was really sweet and avoided the attack, and actually kind of turned the attack on the intruder, and the intruder almost dragged 22 out of the nest, leaving the nest. But didn't get the fish, and 22 got it and ate it. And, that's pretty much so the excitement for the day on Sunday. 22 spends quite a bit of time in the nest tree, behind the church in the big pine, and he also likes that overhang, the little low overhang over the pond. He likes hanging out there. But again, at 9 p.m. he's not in the nest tree, and that makes 2 nights in a row he hasn't spent the night in the tree, and that's pretty much so going to become a thing. So 5:15 Monday. At 6:30, nobody's in the tree, but at 6:40, he comes flying in. At 8:03, M15 returns with a squirrel. 22 follows him into the nest and gets and eats. At 10:58, M15 returns to the nest with a fish. 22 comes and gets and eats it. So I made a note that on this day, this is like the 3rd day in a row that he's come into the nest tree in the afternoon or in the evening and has been pestered by these mockingbirds that just won't leave him alone. And they eventually chase him off. Him and his dad do not like to be touched by those little birds. Some of y'all may have saw it, but there was a video of from one of the ground people on the ground where the little mockingbird actually landed on his tail while he was flying. So that was kind of funny. It was a funny video. But at 9 o'clock again, nobody's up in the nest tree. So that brings us to Tuesday, 5:16. At 6:27, 22 flies to the nest. He's getting pestered by them mockingbirds. At 6:38, he goes to ground and grabs something white and flies to the office oak with it. It looked like a piece of trash to me, white paper sack or something. At 11:15, M15 returns with a fish. 22 follows him in and gets that fish and eats. At 12:35, I see M15 flying over the pond with prey towards the office oak, and you could hear 22 being vocal in the background, and that looked like a pretty good sized prey item, maybe an opossum or a rabbit. 22, I'm sure he got that, because later on at 4:03 p.m. 22 flies to the nest with a fish. kind of got a glimpse of him coming in. You could see the fish in his talons. So he's in the nest for a while with that fish and is not eating it because his crop is just packed. Now, at 4:30, M15 flies to the nest tree. And M15 makes several attempts to get that fish, and 22 blocks him several times. But finally at 5:16, M's just too fast for him, and M flies down and snatches and grabs and flies off to the office oak with that fish. And 22 was just sitting there kind of stunned. I'm sure 22 didn't catch that fish. Dad caught it. So Dad can steal a fish or two from 22 occasionally if 22's not going to eat them. And at the very least, maybe 22 learned a lesson. I better either eat my fish or protect them. Then at 9 p.m., nobody's in the nest tree. So that brings us to 5:17 Wednesday at 6:32. 22 flies into the nest tree. Pretty slow day. Don't see M15 all day. I only really saw 22 twice. A couple times in the nest tree. That one time in the morning, and then in the early afternoon, and that was it. And then again at 9 p.m., nobody's in the tree. Brings us to Thursday, 5:18. At 6:45, E22 is not in the nest tree. He does not show up to the nest till about 12 p.m. And that's when he flies into the nest. And then that's just when it's about rain and a heavy thunderstorm hits. And I see him about 12:03 fly to the office. At 5:46, after a pretty good rain and kind of let up for a while, he flies to the nest tree, but that mockingbird's pestering him, and he ends up flying off. At 9 o'clock, nobody's in the nest tree. We're starting to have an empty nest tree at night. He's starting to show some independence, so that's a good thing. I think in the long run, him not being at the nest tree at night, he's probably going with Dad, or maybe even knows where 21 is and goes and hangs out with 21. So at 5:19, on 5:19 Friday, at 6:18, you see what appears to be an immature bird fly into the nest tree. I knew it wasn't 22 because it wasn't vocalizing when it came in. Shortly after that, at 6:26, E22 flies into the nest tree. And that immature bird does not fly off, and 22's really not giving it a hard time. I was thinking, well, is that 21 maybe? But then Dad came flying in, and as soon as Dad hit the pasture, that bird flew off. So maybe it wasn't 21, but it also flew off. When I say flew off, flew out of screen. So may have landed on the other side of the road, on the side of the pasture, and just been waiting for Dad. It could have been 21. It definitely looked like an immature bird. And 22 wasn't really giving it a hard time for being in the tree. During the morning hours on Friday, I'm seeing 22 all over the nest site. And then about 12 o'clock, you don't see him anymore. At 12:50, M15 goes to the nest with a fish. 22 does not come. Dad stays up there for a while, 30 minutes or so, leaves, and they finally show the nest, and there's a fish in there. but 22 doesn't come. Then at 5:05, M15 returns to the nest trees in the attic. He starts kind of being vocal. 22. M15 drops down and gets that fish and takes off to the office oak. I'm sure he ate it. And then, of course, at 6:37, 22 returns to the nest tree. Very briefly, I think he saw Dad over in the office oak, and he hauled ass over there. You can kind of hear him being vocal in the background. And I think Dad just scolded him and told him, you should have been here. So, and then, of course, at 9 p.m., nobody's in the tree. Brings us to Saturday, 5:20. At 6:52, 22 flies into the nest tree. He's being very vocal. And then they show him a little bit later on the overhang over the pond. Then at 10:23, M15 and 22 comes following him, and they return to the nest. Dad had a squirrel, and 22 got it and started eating it. And he's getting pestered by the mockingbirds, so he picked it up and he flew off with it, like he headed over to the office oak. But then we see him come back with that squirrel at 11:54, and he finishes it off in the nest. I think he does feel comfortable eating in that nest. Then at 1:24, M15 returns with I couldn't tell what it was. Some kind of meat, maybe a bird carcass, I'm not, or a baby, like water type bird. I called it a UFO. 22 got it and started eating. And then shortly right after that, at 1:37, M15 returned with a fish. 22 grabbed that fish and pretty much so ate both those items, finished them off. Then at 3:10, starts raining and a pretty good thunderstorm and a pretty good shower. We don't see anybody the rest of the day. And then, of course, at 9 p.m., there's nobody in the nest tree. Like I said, I think 22's just becoming independent of the nest tree at night. Still likes the nest site during the day, though. When he does get hungry, though, he does go off and hunt for Dad. I assure you. So, not a bad week. Had some decent days. Dad's still bringing him food. There were a couple of days I didn't see Dad all day. You know, for all we know, y'all, Dad could still be taking care of 21 too somewhere. So he could be going back and forth with his time. So don't think that's out of the question with him. We already know what kind of, father he is. He's just outstanding. So we'll see what happens next week. Sooner or later, I gotta think 22 is going to take off eventually, but we'll see. Who knows? So let's talk about Angel and Tom just real quick. I saw where Tom's been bringing in quite a few different prey items, from a chipmunk to squirrels to birds to lizards to little mice, field rats. Let me say something about him. He is a hell of a hunter, and he is a hell of a good-looking red-tailed hawk. Right? He reminds me a lot of Shadow. Jackie and Shadow out in California. Poor Jackie and Shadow. They didn't have their babies. But Shadow always looks so pristine and never has a feather out of place. And that's how Tom always looks. Just always looking just perfect, not a feather out of place. So, really impressed with his hunting. Of course, I've been impressed with Angel's hunting. But Angel found herself a dude. Now, they didn't get off to the greatest of starts, but she's got him on track now. So, hey, if you like the video, leave a like. Please subscribe. and leave me a comment. We'll see you on the next ride. Y'all have a good one.